I saw the body of a strange woman in my son-in-law's basement, blood still dripping onto the floor. Before I could scream, he stepped out of the shadows and whispered, "You'd better forget what you just saw. If you think this is just another ordinary family story, you're dead wrong. Make sure to subscribe so you won't miss our next jaw-dropping episode." The train groaned into the station with a sound that echoed deeper than metal against rail. It was the sound of something ending. Elizabeth Carter stepped off with a black leather handbag in one hand and a single worn-out suitcase in the other. The suitcase had traveled with her through 4 decades of life, family vacations, funeral trips, hospital visits, and now this her one-way ticket to a new chapter she both hoped for and feared. The platform at Seattle's King Street station bustled with the weekend crowd. But for Elizabeth, time slowed. She scanned the waiting area, eyes searching beyond the travelers and taxi lines until she spotted them. Natalie stood in her beige coat, her posture stiff, her arms crossed even though the air wasn't cold. Beside her, Brent scrolled through his phone, half-heartedly glancing up. And then there was Emily. The 12-year-old broke into a grin and ran forward, arms wide. "Grandma." Elizabeth dropped the suitcase without thinking. The hug was warm and tight and smelled of vanilla lotion and bubblegum shampoo. "I missed you so much," Emily whispered, burying her face in her grandmother's scarf. "I missed you more, sweet pea," Elizabeth replied, holding on a second longer than she should have, imprinting the moment like a stamp in her heart. Natalie approached, kissing her mother on the cheek in a motion that felt more ceremonial than affectionate. "Hey, Mom," she said quickly. "Hope the ride wasn't too exhausting." "It was fine." The train was quiet. Elizabeth forced a smile. Brent gave her a nod. "Let me grab that." He reached for the suitcase, then changed his mind halfway and simply gestured toward the car instead. The ride from the station was filled with scattered conversation. Emily's stories from school, Natalie mentioning some deadlines at work, Brent taking a phone call halfway home. Elizabeth watched the city unfold outside the window. Glass towers, rainy sidewalks, intersections, bustling with energy she no longer felt part of. Seattle was not Portland, and her old house, her garden, her kitchen, the living room where she had celebrated every Thanksgiving for decades, was now in someone else's hands. "Here we are," Natalie said, as they pulled into the cul-de-sac. A large modern house loomed ahead, all sharp angles and expensive stonework. Cold, Elizabeth thought instinctively, cold and perfect. Inside the house smelled of lavender plug-ins and lemon cleaning spray. Everything sparkled, too clean to touch, too polished to feel lived in. Emily took her grandmother's hand and led her through the tour kitchen living room, her own bedroom with posters and fairy lights, then finally to Elizabeth's new space, the guest room on the first floor. "You'll be comfortable here," Natalie said, pointing at the beige comforter and empty bookshelf. "It's small but quiet." "I'm sure it's perfect," Elizabeth said, though the room felt less like a home and more like a temporary stop. A rest area. They had dinner that night, takeout Thai served on bone-white plates. Emily chatted between bites, showing off her new phone case. Natalie reminded Brent to confirm a meeting with a VIP client. Brent nodded absently, eyes still glued to emails. Elizabeth spoke sparingly. She had always been the listener, the soft space for others to land. But tonight she felt more like a fly on the wall than a member of the family. After dinner, while Natalie cleaned up and Brent retreated to his office, Elizabeth helped Emily with her science project. They sat on the floor cutting cardboard and gluing plastic pieces onto a makeshift volcano. "I'm glad you're here," Grandma Emily said, eyes focused on the glue stick. "Mom's always too busy. Dad too. And Nanny Ruby left. She said she had migraines, but I think she just didn't like it here." Elizabeth looked at her granddaughter, a quiet pang in her chest. "Well, I'm here now." That night, Elizabeth lay awake, staring at the unfamiliar ceiling. The house creaked differently. Even the silence had a metallic hum to it. She closed her eyes, remembering the last night in her own home, how she had taken one final look at her bookshelf, the family photos on the mantel, the rose bush she'd planted when Natalie was born. It had felt like grief, still did. The following week settled into rhythm. Elizabeth made breakfast, packed Emily's lunch, and watered the garden. She vacuumed the carpet when Natalie forgot and cleaned the kitchen after Brent's late-night snack runs. The work wasn't hard, it was the invisibility that wore her down. "Thanks, Mom," Natalie would say without looking up from her laptop. "Could you also fold that laundry?" "Sure," Elizabeth would reply. Brent stopped saying thank you altogether. One afternoon, while dusting the living room, Elizabeth overheard them through the half-closed door of Brent's office. "She's staying longer than we expected," Natalie whispered. "She sold her house, Nat. Where is she supposed to go?" Brent's voice was low but tight. "I know, she's always around, always listening." Elizabeth stepped away before she heard more. Her hands trembled, and not from age. Later that evening, she offered to cook dinner. Emily lit up at the idea of Grandma's baked ziti. Natalie raised a brow. "Just make sure it's gluten-free. Brent's watching his carbs." "I'll adapt the recipe," Elizabeth said. She spent an hour in the kitchen. The smell of garlic and oregano filled the space, but when she brought the dish to the table, Brent didn't show. Natalie pushed her food around the plate. Emily said it was delicious, but the silence that followed was louder than any compliment. A few days later, Elizabeth caught Natalie scrolling through care facility websites on her laptop. "You're thinking of moving again?" she asked gently. Natalie startled. "Oh no, it's just research." Elizabeth nodded, pretending not to notice the tab labeled Senior Independent Living Options. She said nothing. Not yet. Another week passed. Elizabeth began waking up early, taking walks around the block just to breathe. She missed her rose garden, her book club, her Tuesday mornings with the ladies at the coffee shop. Here her life had shrunk to chores and corners. Even the family photos on the wall showed no sign of her, just Natalie, Brent, and Emily in posed smiles and tropical resorts. One evening, Elizabeth sat with Emily watching an old cartoon. The girl snuggled into her side. "Grandma, do you miss your old house?" Elizabeth hesitated. "Sometimes." "Do you miss living alone?" Elizabeth smiled sadly. "I miss being seen." Emily blinked. "But I see you." "I know, sweetheart, and that makes all the difference." The next morning, Elizabeth caught Brent speaking rapidly on the phone in the kitchen. "No, we keep it off the books. These clients don't want records. Cash only." His back was turned. Elizabeth stood frozen sponge in hand. When he saw her, he snapped the phone shut. "You need something?" he asked coolly. "No, just cleaning." He nodded and walked past her without another word. That night at dinner, no one spoke much. Brent was buried in his phone again. Natalie looked exhausted. Emily Chipper, as always, chatted about a field trip. Elizabeth watched them, her eyes moving from face to face. This was her family. These were the people she gave up everything to be near. And somehow she felt further away than ever. After dinner, Natalie asked her to take out the trash. Brent reminded her that the dishwasher needed unloading. She nodded, said nothing. But inside, something had shifted. Later, alone in her room, she opened her suitcase, the same one she brought from Portland. She hadn't unpacked fully. Not really. At the bottom was a small photo album, pictures of her Natalie as a child, her late husband, birthdays, holidays. Life. Real life. She flipped to a photo of Emily as a toddler, frosting smeared across her cheeks. Then she closed the album. She stared at the door. Outside, the house was quiet, but inside her a storm was beginning to stir. The scent of bergamot tea filled the kitchen, but it couldn't warm the silence. Elizabeth stood by the stove, her hands steady, even if her heart wasn't. It had been 3 weeks since she moved into Natalie's home. 3 weeks of folded laundry, morning drop-offs, evening dishes. 3 weeks of polite nods, brief exchanges, and smiles that felt carefully constructed, like the floral arrangements Brent kept on the kitchen island, attractive, lifeless, untouchable. Natalie entered the kitchen with her phone pressed to her ear. She gave her mother a cursory glance, barely registering her presence, and continued speaking in that clipped corporate voice she used with clients. "Yes, Thursday works. But not before noon. I have the pediatric summit and Brent's funder dinner." She poured herself coffee without breaking stride. Elizabeth waited a beat. "Good morning, sweetheart." Natalie pressed the mute button. "Morning. Can you make sure Emily takes her clarinet today?" She left it in the den again. "Of course," Elizabeth said gently, but her daughter was already gone, her voice rising again into the polished hallway. It echoed down the staircase like a radio that had been left on in a room nobody wanted to enter. Elizabeth sipped her tea alone. Later that day, after dropping Emily off at school, she returned to an empty house. Brent was at the clinic. Natalie had meetings. And for the first time in weeks, the house didn't feel merely sterile. It felt like a museum, pristine and haunted. She moved through her chores methodically. Wipe counters, fold towels, fluff pillows. She found herself adjusting the frames in the hallway again, photo after photo of smiling faces Brent, shaking hands with a local senator Natalie, at a charity gala Emily in ballet shoes. There was no photo of her. She didn't take it personally, or at least she told herself that. At noon, Brent returned home for lunch. He walked into the kitchen and scrubbed, scrolling through his phone, then glanced up. "There's no lemon water in the fridge," he said. Not a question, not a complaint, just a statement with an undertone. "I didn't realize we were out," Elizabeth replied, already reaching for the pitcher. Brent didn't respond. He sat down at the breakfast bar, his posture casual but rigid, one leg crossed over the other, phone still in hand. Elizabeth peeled and sliced lemons in silence. "What's that smell?" he asked after a moment. "I was baking banana bread for Emily's class fundraiser," she said. Brent grunted. "Smells strong." "She loves it," Elizabeth added, but Brent had already returned to his screen. Later that night, Elizabeth heard it again. She was in bed half asleep when the sound came, muted at first, like the dragging of something heavy. Then a sharp metallic clink followed by what sounded like running water, then a low hum, mechanical and unnatural. She sat up, heart thudding. The noise came from the basement, Brent's basement. He'd converted the lower level into a personal research suite 2 years ago, Natalie once told her. It was where he tested new instruments, analyzed prototypes, experimented with 3D printed surgical models. "I like to keep my work private," Brent had said with a cool smile when she first moved in. "Privacy is essential in my line of work." Elizabeth had respected that, until now. She slipped out of bed, wrapped her shawl around her shoulders, and stepped into the hallway. The house was silent, cloaked in darkness, except for the faint light that spilled from beneath the basement door. The mechanical hum grew louder as she crept closer. She stopped at the top of the stairs. From beneath a voice, Brent's low, serious, but not speaking in words. It sounded more like him counting, instructing, pacing. A shadow passed across the light from underneath the door. Then another noise, a clatter, followed by a sharp intake of breath. A woman's breath. Elizabeth froze. She stood there for a moment too long, clutching her shawl. Then just as suddenly the light clicked off. Silence. The kind of silence that didn't feel empty but alert. She stepped back into her room, heart pounding. The next morning, Natalie asked her to make Brent's breakfast. "He's got a busy day," she said, brushing mascara on her lashes. "He's presenting to the Board of Regenerative Aesthetics." Elizabeth nodded and started the omelet. The kitchen clock ticked loudly as Brent entered, freshly showered, sharp in a tailored gray suit. He took the plate, wordlessly sat, and began eating. Elizabeth tried to speak. "I heard noises last night." Brent didn't look up. "The pipes. This house creaks." There was a voice. Brent set down his fork. Finally he met her eyes. "Must have been the television. I like to work with noise in the background." His tone was even, dismissive. But behind his eyes was something else, a stillness so pronounced it felt like tension disguised as calm. Elizabeth nodded and said nothing more. But the noises didn't stop. 3 nights later, she heard it again, this time sharper. A groan, a knock, a single shout quickly muffled, and once again the humming. She didn't sleep the rest of the night. During the day, she returned to her routine. She watered the plants that Natalie never touched. She refolded the towels Brent had wrinkled. She picked up Emily, who chattered about gym class and a new math quiz. Grandma Emily asked suddenly, "Why don't you ever leave the house?" Elizabeth smiled. "This house keeps me busy." "Do you like it here?" The question struck her like a slap wrapped in sugar. "I like being near you," she said, brushing a strand of hair from the girl's forehead. Emily grinned, satisfied. The following morning, as Elizabeth was bringing the trash bin to the curb, she noticed a black sedan parked across the street. Tinted windows, engine still running. A woman stepped out, mid-30s, thin-frame blonde hair tied in a loose bun. She walked slowly, head down, sunglasses masking her eyes. She clutched her coat tighter despite the warm air. Elizabeth paused by the garage, watching. The woman didn't knock on the front door. She moved along the side of the house toward the basement entrance. The door opened before she could knock. Brent stood there, eyes scanning the street. Elizabeth ducked behind the side hedge, her breath caught in her chest. The woman entered. The door closed. 20 minutes later, the woman emerged, stumbling slightly, her face pale and damp. Her hand clutched her side. Her other arm was bandaged, the same coat now draped loosely over her shoulders. She didn't look back as she reached the sedan, climbed inside, and was driven away. Elizabeth couldn't move. She waited until the taillights disappeared. That night at dinner, Natalie smiled as if everything were fine. She told Emily about a parent-teacher meeting. Brent complimented the lamb chops. Elizabeth said little. Her hands shook when she passed the salt. She excused herself early and returned to her room. Her heart thundered in her ears. She opened her notebook, the one she kept hidden in the drawer, and wrote down every detail, the noises, the woman, the bandages, the sedan. She didn't know what Brent was doing down there, but she knew one thing with certainty. It wasn't research. It wasn't legal. And it wasn't safe. What terrified her most, though, wasn't what Brent was doing. It was how easily Natalie pretended not to see it. Or worse, how willingly. That night, Elizabeth stared at the ceiling until dawn, listening for the next noise. She didn't know when she would act, only that she would. And that when she did, it would be far too late for them to call it just a family matter. It started with a smell. Not strong, not foul, but sharp, an iron-like edge that sliced through the clean lavender scent of the house like a secret trying to escape. Elizabeth paused in the hallway near the kitchen, holding a folded dish towel in one hand. She sniffed the air again. It was faint metallic, familiar in a way that her instincts recognized before her mind could name it. Blood. She followed it down the hallway, her footsteps light, slow. The smell wasn't constant. It moved with the air, stronger at certain spots, vanishing in others, like it was hiding, like it didn't want to be found. Then she passed the door to the basement. The smell sharpened there, pressing itself into her nostrils. She stared at the door for a long moment. It was slightly ajar. That alone was strange. Brent always kept it locked. Always. She looked around. The house was silent. Natalie had taken Emily to a dance rehearsal. Brent was supposedly at the clinic. Supposedly. Elizabeth reached for the doorknob, heart thudding. She hesitated, then pushed it open gently. The stairs yawned into darkness. She reached for the wall, found the switch. The light flickered on dim, cold industrial. She took one careful step, then another. The basement wasn't finished in the traditional sense. The upper half was painted concrete and fluorescent lighting, sparsely furnished with steel shelves and metal cabinets. One side held medical equipment, exam table, sterilization machines, a black leather chair with arm restraints. The far end was draped in plastic sheeting. A red light blinked from a panel near a tall metal cabinet. She was about to turn around, about to convince herself she didn't see what she knew she saw, when the smell hit her full force. She turned toward the far corner. That was when she saw it, a shape lying on the floor, covered in a gray hospital sheet, still, too still. Elizabeth's knees went weak, but her body moved forward anyway, as if against her will. Every step felt like walking through molasses. She could see pale fingers protruding from beneath the sheet. Blood, dried dark. A small pool had congealed beneath the corner of the blanket. It wasn't fresh, but it was real. Then she heard the footsteps behind her. She froze. Brent's voice sliced through the air behind her like a blade wrapped in silk. "You weren't supposed to be down here." She turned. He stood at the base of the stairs, sleeves rolled up, latex gloves still on. He wasn't angry. He wasn't yelling. His voice was calm, even. That terrified her more than any rage would have. She stammered, her throat closing. The door was open. I smelled. Brent walked forward slowly, each step deliberate, controlled. "You should go back upstairs, Elizabeth." "What happened to her?" Her voice was barely audible. "Who is she?" "She's nobody." His eyes were steel. "She came of her own will, paid in cash. Wanted results fast. She knew the risk." Elizabeth's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Brent kept walking toward her, his face a mask of tranquil menace. "I need you to forget what you saw," he said. "For your own good, for Natalie, for Emily." Elizabeth backed up instinctively. You need to call someone. This is a crime." Brent tilted his head. No, it's a complication, one that will be dealt with. She's dead, and nothing you say will change that now. The air was thin. Elizabeth couldn't breathe. You think they'll believe you? He asked almost gently. You're 70. No proof. No camera. Just your word against mine, against a decorated surgeon, against Natalie. He took off the gloves slowly, like peeling off another skin. Go upstairs, wash your hands. Have some tea. You didn't see anything. He walked past her toward the table, opened a drawer, pulled out a bottle of alcohol and surgical tape. The way he moved, unbothered, precise, sent a tremor down Elizabeth's spine. She backed toward the stairs. Brent didn't look at her again. Upstairs the light looked different, the air heavier. She washed her hands twice, scrubbed under her nails. Her skin turned red, but she couldn't feel it. All she saw was the pale hand beneath the sheet. The way Brent had said, "She's nobody." She went to her room and locked the door. Her hands trembled as she picked up her phone. 911. Her thumb hovered over the screen, but she didn't press it. She thought of Emily, of Natalie, of what a scandal would do to the family, of Brent's voice calm and poisonous. They won't believe you. The front door opened. She heard Natalie's voice and Emily's laughter. It sounded distant, muted. She stood in the middle of her room, frozen. Then she walked out. Natalie was putting groceries away in the kitchen. Emily was upstairs. Elizabeth moved slowly like an old machine reactivating. "Natalie," she said. Her daughter turned, smiling. "Mom, we got the almond milk you like," Emily insisted. Elizabeth didn't smile. "Can we talk?" Natalie blinked. "Of course." They went into the study. Elizabeth closed the door. "I went down to the basement," she said. Natalie's smile fell instantly. "You what?" "The door was open. I smelled blood." Natalie's face went pale. "I saw a body." Natalie stared at her, lips parting, but no words forming. "Brent told me to forget it, but I can't." For a moment, Natalie looked like she was going to collapse. Then something hardened in her face. "You're confused." Elizabeth flinched. "You've always had an active imagination. You used to accuse the mailman of opening our letters, remember? When you forgot, you did it yourself. This isn't a letter, Natalie. This is someone's daughter, someone's life." Natalie stood up. "You don't know what you saw. I know what death smells like. Mom." Natalie's voice cracked. "You can't do this. You can't destroy our lives." "I'm not trying to, but I can't pretend I didn't see it." Natalie's expression twisted, grief, panic, rage. "You're being dramatic. You want to feel important. You've always needed to be the one in control." Elizabeth's eyes burned. "This isn't about me. Isn't it? You hate Brent. You always have." Elizabeth stared at her daughter. "This is about right and wrong." Natalie shook her head as if trying to shake off a nightmare. "Mom, if you say anything, Emily's life will be ruined. She loves her father. We'll lose everything. Brent's career, our home, our name. Maybe you should have thought of that before letting this happen." Natalie stepped forward. "Please, just this once, don't get involved. Let us handle it." "Handle it how? Sweep it under the rug like she was nothing." Natalie's eyes filled with tears, but they didn't fall. "Please don't do this to us." Elizabeth's voice dropped. "I'm not doing this to you, Natalie. You're doing it to yourselves." She walked out. Natalie didn't follow. That night, Elizabeth sat by her window, the moon casting shadows across the garden. She didn't sleep. She didn't cry. She just stared at the streetlight, waiting for the courage she knew would have to come soon. Because someone was dead, and silence was no longer an option. The roast chicken sat untouched in the center of the table, its golden skin steaming slightly beneath the dining room chandelier. Crystal water glasses shimmered beside folded napkins, and classical music played softly through the wireless speaker perched above the bar cart. It looked like a picture-perfect family dinner, the kind Elizabeth used to dream of when she imagined growing old among loved ones. But the air was tight tonight. Emily was unusually quiet, pushing peas around her plate. Brent cut his food with clinical precision. Natalie scrolled through her phone between bites, occasionally grunting in acknowledgement of someone's comment. Elizabeth sat across from her granddaughter, watching every movement, every subtle flinch. "Emily," she said gently, "did something happen at school today?" The girl shook her head. "No." "Are you sure? You seem off." Emily glanced at her father, then back at her plate. Elizabeth felt the chill creep up her spine. She looked at Brent. He didn't meet her gaze. His fork and knife clinked rhythmically against the plate. "I'm just tired," Emily mumbled. Elizabeth leaned forward, her voice quiet but firm. You're not afraid of something, are you, sweetheart? Brent's head lifted slowly. Natalie set her phone down. Mom, she said, warning already in her voice. But Elizabeth wasn't looking at her. She was watching Emily, whose small hands were trembling slightly beneath the table. Emily, she whispered, you can tell me anything. You know that, right? The girl nodded, but her lips were pressed into a tight line. Then she stood abruptly. I'm not hungry, she said, and turned to leave. Hey, Natalie called after her. We're having a family meal. But Emily was already halfway up the stairs. Elizabeth's heart twisted. When the girl's footsteps faded, the silence at the table roared. You shouldn't have done that, Brent said coldly, dabbing the corner of his mouth with a napkin. Elizabeth turned to Natalie. She's afraid of him. Natalie's eyes narrowed. Excuse me? Don't act like you don't see it, Elizabeth said. She flinches every time he speaks. That's not tiredness. That's fear. She's a teenager, Natalie snapped. They're dramatic. No, Elizabeth said, her voice steadier now. You know the difference. You just don't want to admit it. Natalie stood. Stop, she hissed. Just stop. Brent said nothing. He stared at Elizabeth with the same cold detachment he'd worn in the basement. The look of a man above consequences. You've always needed someone to blame, Natalie continued. First my father, now my husband. You can't stand not being the center of things. I'm not blaming, Elizabeth said, rising slowly. I'm protecting. Protecting, Natalie barked, a short, sharp laugh. From what a father who works 18-hour days to give us this house, this life. Elizabeth took a breath. You know what he's done. You've seen it. Natalie's face darkened, her hands balled into fists. Stop it, she said, right now. But Elizabeth didn't stop. I saw the body, Natalie. I saw her. I saw what you're both covering up. The sound came out of nowhere, a sharp crack of flesh against flesh. Elizabeth staggered a half-step backward, hand flying to her cheek. For a moment the world paused. Natalie stood with her arms still raised, chest heaving. Brent had not moved. The chandelier above flickered slightly, casting fractured light over the table. The sting bloomed across Elizabeth's face, hot and unreal. But the pain was nothing compared to the echo of her daughter's eyes she'd once rocked to sleep, now filled with rage. You will not destroy this family, Natalie said through clenched teeth. Do you hear me? Elizabeth said nothing. The air was thick with silence. Then Emily's voice called from the top of the stairs. Quiet, frightened. Grandma. Elizabeth turned her head slowly as if underwater. I'm okay, sweetheart, she said, forcing calm into her voice. It's all right. But it wasn't. Emily didn't come down. She didn't say another word. Natalie sat back down at the table, visibly trembling. Brent resumed cutting his food as if nothing had happened. Elizabeth stood alone. She didn't eat, she didn't speak. She simply walked out of the room. Back in her bedroom, she closed the door and leaned against it, chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. Her cheek still burned, not just from the slap, but from the truth behind it. They would rather silence her with violence than face what they'd done. She walked to the dresser, opened the top drawer, and pulled out the old suitcase she'd never fully unpacked. It was time. She moved like someone in a dream, pulling clothes from hangers, stacking books, carefully slipping Emily's last drawing of them together between the pages of a notebook. She paused only once to look in the mirror. A red mark was blooming across her left cheek, but her expression was unreadable, hardened, not by anger, not even grief, by certainty. She wrote a note and left it on the dresser. Natalie, I loved you first. I loved you longest, but I will not stay silent. Elizabeth. She zipped the suitcase. Midnight came like an old friend. She sat on the edge of the bed, the suitcase beside her, hands folded neatly in her lap. Outside the window, the city pulsed quietly beneath the clouds. Somewhere nearby, a train horn sounded a low, mournful cry. Footsteps padded down the hallway. A knock at the door. Grandma. It was Emily. A whisper. Elizabeth stood, opened the door just enough to see her face. The girl's eyes were wide-rimmed with tears. Are you leaving? She asked. Elizabeth nodded slowly. Because of Dad. Because of everything, Elizabeth whispered. Emily glanced over her shoulder. Can I come with you? The question broke her. She knelt, cupping the girl's face. Not now, my darling, but I'll write. And you can write back. You'll always have me. Emily hugged her tight. So tight. Elizabeth closed her eyes, burying her face in the child's hair. A moment later, they separated. Go to bed, sweetheart, Elizabeth said softly. Don't let them know you were here. Emily nodded, hesitated, then turned and disappeared down the hall. Elizabeth closed the door, locked it. Then she picked up the suitcase and opened the window. Her room was on the first floor. The yard sloped gently down to the back gate. She stepped out, suitcase in hand, heart pounding like a girl running away for the first time. But she wasn't running away. She was walking out, on her terms, and this time she wasn't looking back. The lake outside the motel window was still gray and swollen with the weight of morning fog. A single canoe drifted near the reeds, its owner unseen. Elizabeth stood behind the curtain, her breath forming faint condensation on the glass. Her suitcase sat by the bed unopened. Her coat still smelled faintly of lavender and dish soap from the Carter household. She hadn't slept, not really, but she had made it out. That mattered more. The room she had found on short notice was a crumbling lakeside lodge, the kind travelers used for fishing trips or quiet disappearances. The paint on the windowsills had peeled back to reveal splinters of green and blue. The heating unit groaned every 30 minutes like an old man waking from bad dreams. Still, it was safe, quiet, hers. She poured herself a cup of the bitter motel brand coffee and sat down with the small leather notebook she had kept hidden from everyone in Natalie's house. Within its pages were months of observations, little nothings at the time now rearranged, like puzzle pieces forming a portrait of dread. A list of clients who came through the back door. Late-night deliveries packages Brent received with no logos, no barcodes, no return addresses. A spreadsheet she'd glimpsed once on his laptop full of dates and initials with colored notes in the margins green, yellow, red. She didn't understand all of it, but Anne would. Anne Delaney was the kind of woman who could smell a lie before it left someone's lips. She had been a force of nature even in college, editor of the campus newspaper, unafraid to go toe-to-toe with faculty, police, politicians. In the years since she'd made a name for herself, uncovering fraud at local hospitals, backdoor dealings in city contracts, even a drug smuggling ring operating out of a nursing home in Spokane. If there was someone who could make sense of Brent's shadows, it was Anne. Elizabeth found her contact info in the back of her address book, circled 3 times in red ink from years ago. Only in case of revolution, Anne had joked when she gave it. Elizabeth dialed. 3 rings. Delaney. That voice still brisk, sharp, as if she'd been born interrogating people. Anne Elizabeth said quietly, "It's Liz Carter." A pause. Then the tone softened almost imperceptibly. "Liz, damn. That's a voice I never expected to hear again. You okay?" "No," Elizabeth said. "That's why I'm calling." Another pause, heavier this time. "Tell me where you are." 2 hours later, Anne pulled into the parking lot in a muddy blue Subaru, the kind with bumper stickers about free press and climate reform peeling at the corners. She stepped out wearing black jeans, scuffed boots, and a gray peacoat lined with pins. Her hair, once raven black, was now steel gray and pulled into a loose bun. Her eyes behind square glasses missed nothing. "Well," Anne said, sizing her up, "you don't look dead. That's a start." Elizabeth tried to smile, failed. Anne took her into her arms, brief and firm, and then pulled back. "Let's go inside. Start from the beginning." They sat at the tiny table by the window. Anne pulled out a digital recorder but set it aside unopened. "Not yet," she said. "Talk to me like a friend first." So Elizabeth did. She started with the move to Seattle, the slow unraveling of her role in the house, the silent cruelty. The night she smelled blood, the body in the basement, Brent's cold, unblinking face, Natalie's slap. Anne didn't interrupt once. She listened the way only old friends and seasoned journalists can, completely with silence sharper than any question. When Elizabeth finished, Anne leaned back in her chair and blew out a long breath. "Jesus, Liz, I know. Are you sure the girl was dead?" She wasn't breathing. Her skin, it was blue. Anne looked out at the lake for a moment. The canoe was gone now, the water still gray. And Natalie knew. She said I was imagining it, but her eyes, she knew. Anne nodded slowly. Then she leaned forward, elbows on the table. "I'm going to ask you something brutal. You ready?" Elizabeth nodded. "Why didn't you call the cops that night?" Elizabeth looked down at her hands. "Because I didn't think they'd believe me. Because I was scared of what it would do to Emily. Because part of me didn't want it to be true." Anne didn't answer right away. Then she said, "You stayed quiet too long, but that doesn't mean it's too late." Elizabeth opened her notebook and slid it across the table. I don't have a lot. But I started writing things down when I noticed how strange Brent's schedule was. The deliveries, the women who left that house looking like ghosts. Anne flipped through the pages. Her fingers slowed at a list of initials and timestamps. "This is good," she murmured. "Very good." She closed the notebook, tapped it twice with her finger. "But it's not enough." Elizabeth nodded, I figured. Anne stood and walked to her car. When she came back, she had a laptop, a portable scanner, and a manila folder stuffed with Post-its. "I need digital copies of this. And I need names, clients, staff, anyone who might be willing to talk." "They're scared," Elizabeth said. "They always are," Anne replied. For the next hour, they worked side by side. Elizabeth gave her what she could: dates, descriptions, observations. Anne cross-referenced online records, property data, even Yelp reviews of Brent's private clinic. "I'm going to make some calls," she said. "I know someone at the state medical board, and a nurse who used to temp at those boutique surgical spots. There's a whole underworld of this stuff, Liz. Rich women flying in for off-the-record procedures, paying cash to stay off insurance reports." Elizabeth rubbed her eyes. "He called her nobody, the girl, when I found her." Anne looked at her sharply. "What did you say?" "He said she was nobody, like she didn't matter." Anne's jaw clenched. "Then let's make her matter." The sun dipped lower, casting orange light across the table. Anne leaned back, thinking. "We'll need more. Photos, recordings, testimony. I can start the legwork, but you have to decide something." "What?" Anne leaned in. "Are you ready to go public?" Elizabeth felt her stomach twist. "I'm not a whistleblower," she said. "I'm just a grandmother." "Bullshit," Anne said softly. "You're the only person who saw that girl and gave a damn. That makes you dangerous to the right people. I don't want to destroy my family." "Then they shouldn't have built their life on a corpse." Silence settled between them. Outside, the fog began to lift. Anne packed up her scanner, her folders. "I'll be back in 2 days," she said. "Stay here. Don't talk to anyone. Don't go back to that house no matter what happens." Elizabeth nodded. Anne paused at the door. "Liz." "Yes." "You're brave, braver than you think." After she left, Elizabeth sat alone for a long time. The recorder Anne had left, still untouched, on the table. The lake outside shimmered as the fog receded. And in that quiet, for the first time since she had walked out of Natalie's house, Elizabeth Carter allowed herself to breathe, not in fear but in resolve. She was no longer standing in anyone's shadow. She was stepping into her own light. The woman wore a scarf too heavy for spring and sunglasses too large for dusk. She arrived 15 minutes late as arranged and walked straight into the coffee shop on Mercer Street without scanning the room deliberately, like someone who had practiced avoiding attention. Elizabeth sat near the window, hands wrapped tightly around a ceramic cup gone cold an hour ago. Their eyes met, just for a second. The woman approached, sat. "Mrs. Carter," she said in a low voice. Elizabeth offered a soft nod. "Marissa Wright. Used to be." Marissa Delgado had once been the live-in housekeeper for Natalie, and Brent, hired during the pandemic, fired suddenly after only 6 months. Natalie had told Elizabeth it was because the woman had boundary issues. The phrase now rang with irony. "I heard you were asking questions," Marissa said, removing her sunglasses. Her eyes were red, not from tears, but exhaustion. "I need help," Elizabeth said. "And you saw things, didn't you?" Marissa hesitated. "Then, you still talk to him?" "No." "Then maybe we both survived." Elizabeth leaned in. "What did you see?" Marissa looked around the cafe, lowering her voice to a whisper. "There were women," she said. "They came in the back door, always in pairs, never alone. They didn't speak, barely made eye contact. Brent would take them to the basement. Some came out an hour later drugged, some left with their arms in slings. One never came out." Elizabeth's breath caught. "I asked Natalie once. I thought I was being subtle. She told me I was imagining things. 3 days later, I was fired. They paid me extra to keep quiet." "How much extra?" Elizabeth asked. Marissa gave a hollow laugh. "Not enough." Silence fell over the table. Outside, a jogger passed by, oblivious. Inside, 1,000 secrets pressed between the two women like a loaded chamber. Elizabeth slid a napkin across the table. On it was a time, a location. "I need to get into his office," she said, "just one last time." Marissa stared at the napkin for a long moment. Then she folded it into her sleeve. "I know how to get in," she said, "but if we get caught—" "We won't," Elizabeth said. She didn't sound hopeful. She sounded certain. It was midnight when they arrived at the clinic. Brent's private practice was nestled in a quiet strip of boutique medical offices near the water. The parking lot was empty save for a lone security light buzzing above the side entrance. Elizabeth's heart pounded as she stepped out of Marissa's old sedan, the gravel crunching underfoot. The building loomed like a mausoleum. "This way," Marissa whispered, leading her to the service door. I kept the old code. A soft beep, a click. The door opened. Inside the hallway was bathed in sterile blue lighting. The place smelled faintly of antiseptic and synthetic air freshener. Elizabeth followed Marissa down a corridor lined with closed doors, labeled with Brent's initials, BAC MD. Marissa led her to the end of the hall where a frosted glass door waited. Brent's office. She pulled out a small key from her boot. "I made a copy before I left," she whispered. "Didn't know why. Guess I do now." The door clicked open. They slipped inside. It was immaculate. Too immaculate. The desk gleamed perfectly aligned pens in a holder. No papers. No clutter. A leather-bound planner sat in the center closed. Marissa moved swiftly to the filing cabinet in the corner. Elizabeth approached the bookshelf, oddly shallow, filled with fake books designed for aesthetic. "Help me," Marissa said. They opened drawers, pulling folders, photographing whatever they could, billing ledgers, shipping slips, signed NDAs from anonymous clients. Then Elizabeth noticed something. Behind a framed diploma Columbia Medical School honors a panel was loose. She lifted it carefully. "A safe." Marissa stepped beside her. "You know the code?" "No," Elizabeth said, "but I know Brent." She tried his birthday. Nothing. Emily's, still nothing. Then she typed in the date she saw on the spreadsheet months ago. The first green flag patient. The beginning of everything. Click. The door swung open. Inside was a small black external hard drive, 2 passports, and a thick envelope of cash. Elizabeth took the drive. Marissa held it stunned. "He kept it here." "We need to go," Elizabeth said. They locked the office, retraced their steps, and slipped back out into the night. Back at the motel, Elizabeth paced the room as Marissa stared at the device sitting on the table between them. "I don't even want to know what's on it," Marissa muttered. "I just want it gone." "I'll take care of it," Elizabeth said. Marissa stood. Her hands trembled as she picked up her coat. "If anything happens to me," she said, "promise me you'll tell someone." "I will." Marissa left without looking back. Elizabeth called Anne. "It's done," she said. Anne arrived 30 minutes later in sweatpants and a hoodie, eyes lit with adrenaline. "You really did it," she said, holding up the hard drive like it was sacred. "I want this in the right hands," Elizabeth said. "Can you get it to someone who won't bury it?" Anne nodded. "I know a lawyer in Olympia. Used to be a federal prosecutor. Keeps a low profile now, but still has reach. I'll go tonight." Elizabeth hesitated. "I want to know what's on it." Anne opened her laptop, plugged in the drive. They sat side by side, staring as folders populated the screen, client files, surgery vids, FDA drafts, alt records redacted. Anne opened one marked Q4 outcomes. Rows of data spilled across the screen. Patient IDs, surgery dates, complications, notes, seizures, hematoma, cardiac arrest, facial nerve damage, renal failure. More than a dozen flagged as fatal. Anne's voice dropped to a whisper. "He's been covering up deaths." Elizabeth's hand flew to her mouth. Anne clicked open a document titled FDA Submission, Final Draft. The same cases except the complications column read, minor or resolved. Fatalities had been removed. One note read, delete red data from public-facing version. "Bastard," Anne muttered. Elizabeth sat back numb. Anne turned to her. "Do you want to go public with this?" Elizabeth shook her head slowly. "I want it stopped. I don't care if no one knows my name. I just want it to end." Anne nodded. "Then this goes to the lawyer, tonight." Elizabeth picked up her phone, typed a message to a number she hadn't used in weeks. "Emily, sweetheart, I miss you. I hope you're okay. Just know Grandma is doing the right thing, even if it feels scary." She pressed send. Outside, a light rain began to fall. The storm was coming, and Elizabeth Carter was finally ready for it. The news broke just after sunrise. Elizabeth sat in the corner booth of a small diner off Route 99, a half-empty cup of coffee cooling beside her hand when the story flashed across the television above the counter. The volume was low, but the headline scrolled bold and red across the bottom of the screen. "Seattle's celebrity surgeon accused of illegal operations." Multiple deaths. The anchor's voice was calm, clinical, unnervingly detached as they listed charges. Falsification of medical records, unlicensed surgeries, obstruction of justice, and possible manslaughter. A grainy mugshot of Brent appeared next, a far cry from the airbrushed profile photos that once decorated his clinic's website. He looked tired, stunned, a man suddenly stripped of his armor. Elizabeth didn't flinch. She sipped her coffee. He had been arrested at SeaTac Airport moments before boarding a private flight to Los Angeles. Anonymous tip, the anchor said. Suspected flight risk. He hadn't even told Natalie he was leaving. Anne had moved quickly. The footage cut to a swarm of reporters outside the courthouse. Microphones thrust, cameras flashing, and then there she was. Natalie, her hair disheveled, mascara streaking down her cheeks, sunglasses barely holding back the flood of her expression. She shoved her way through the crowd, shielding Emily with one arm as they pushed toward a waiting car. Elizabeth exhaled, her fingers tightening around the mug. It was done. He was caught. But the cost was only beginning. The knock came that afternoon. She didn't need to look through the peephole to know who it was. When she opened the motel door, Natalie stood there, shoulders hunched in a pale trench coat, her eyes raw and swollen. There was no makeup today, no curated expression, just a woman hollowed by consequences. Elizabeth stepped aside without a word. Natalie walked in and sat on the edge of the bed like someone who didn't know where else to put her grief. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then Natalie whispered, "You turned us in." Elizabeth didn't deny it. "I didn't do it to hurt you," she said. "I did it to stop him." Natalie nodded slowly. "He was going to leave us, take the accounts, vanish into some gated community in California." "I know." Natalie looked at her mother, and for a moment she wasn't a grown woman anymore. She was a little girl afraid of the dark. "I didn't know how to leave," she said. "I didn't know how to stop it." Elizabeth sat across from her, quiet. "You didn't try," she said gently, "and that was your choice." Natalie covered her face with both hands. Her shoulders shook. "I didn't know how to be strong like you." Elizabeth's heart cracked, but she didn't move to comfort her. Natalie lowered her hands and looked up, eyes pleading. "Emily won't talk to me. She blames me for everything." Elizabeth didn't answer. "She wants to come live with you," Natalie said. "Please, just for a while." The silence that followed was suffocating. Then Elizabeth spoke, her voice soft but firm as iron. "I won't rescue someone who doesn't want to be free." Natalie flinched. "She's 12. She's braver than both of us," Elizabeth said. "But she needs her mother right now, not a replacement. But I don't know how to be that anymore." "Then learn," Elizabeth whispered, "the same way I had to." Tears streamed down Natalie's cheeks, and for a moment Elizabeth wanted to reach out, wanted to wrap her arms around her daughter and pretend the last 6 months hadn't happened. But the scars were real, and they had to be faced. Natalie stood shakily. "I don't deserve her." Elizabeth stood too. "Then earn her." Natalie stepped toward the door, pausing with her hand on the knob. "I was scared, Mom, all the time. I was so afraid of losing everything." Elizabeth gave a sad smile. "Sometimes losing everything is the only way to find what matters." Natalie nodded slowly, then she left. The door clicked shut behind her. Elizabeth stood still, her hands trembling now that she was finally alone again. The phone rang at twilight. Elizabeth recognized the number instantly. She answered on the first ring. Grandma Emily's voice was quiet, wobbly. "Hi, sweetheart," Elizabeth said, her throat tightening. There was a pause. "Dad's gone," Emily said. "They said he did bad things. Really bad." "I know," Elizabeth replied. Another pause. "Mom's been crying all day. She barely talks." "She's hurting," Emily sniffled. "Is it true you helped catch him?" Elizabeth's voice cracked. "Yes." "Good." Silence. "I miss you," Emily said finally. "I miss you more." Another pause. Then, "Grandma, do you think we'll ever be a family again?" Elizabeth closed her eyes. "Not the same one, no, but maybe a better one." "I want you to be happy," Emily said, the words tumbling out. "I want you to live somewhere nice. I want you to have a garden and friends and books, and I want you to be proud." "I am proud," Elizabeth whispered. "Of you." Emily's voice broke. "Then promise me something." "Anything." "Promise you won't come back just to fix everything. Promise you'll go be you." Elizabeth felt the tears now, hot, cleansing. "I promise." "Good," Emily said. "Because I want you to live for yourself. Not for me, not for Mom, for you." Elizabeth couldn't speak. She didn't have to. They stayed on the line a few minutes longer, neither wanting to hang up. Then finally softly, "I love you," Elizabeth said. "I love you more," Emily whispered back. The call ended. Elizabeth stared at the phone in her hand, a weight lifted she hadn't even known she carried. The bus to Vermont left at dawn. Anne drove her to the station. They didn't talk much, just exchanged glances, loaded the single suitcase into the luggage hold, and stood in the soft morning fog as the engine warmed. "I can still leak your name," Anne said, "if you ever want to go public." Elizabeth shook her head. "Let him be the name they remember. Let the story speak for itself." Anne nodded. "You're the most unassuming badass I've ever met." Elizabeth chuckled. "Take care of Marissa," she said, "and the others, the ones who can't speak." "I will." The bus doors hissed open. Elizabeth turned toward the steps. Liz Ann called softly. She turned. "I hope you find peace out there." Elizabeth smiled. "I'm not looking for peace." She paused. "I'm building something new." And then she boarded the bus. As the vehicle pulled away, Seattle faded behind her. Its chaos, its wounds, its ghosts. The road ahead curved through pine-covered hills and golden stretches of silence. And Elizabeth Carter, once invisible, once dismissed, sat by the window with the sun warming her face, not as someone's mother, not as someone's burden, but as someone finally free. She wasn't in the shadows anymore. She had become the light. The road that led Elizabeth to Vermont was long and winding, both literally and in the soul-deep way only true change demands. She arrived just as the trees were beginning to turn, crimson, amber, gold, like flames caught in stillness. Her new home stood on the edge of a sleepy town called Maple Hollow, a modest clapboard cottage nestled at the base of a wooded hill. It had a sagging porch and a cracked bird bath in the front yard, but Elizabeth had known the moment she saw it that it was hers. No shadows in the corners, no whispers in the walls, just quiet and the promise of her own breath. She moved in with only 2 suitcases and a toolbox. The realtor, a kindly woman with gray curls and thick glasses, handed her the keys with a hug and a smile. "You're going to love it here," she'd said. "We're not fast, but we're kind." And for the first time in months, Elizabeth believed that might actually be enough. She began to rebuild slowly. The days passed like watercolor soft edges, gentle hues. Each morning she walked into town for groceries or tea. Locals waved, introduced themselves without questions. There was a bakery run by a widower named Thomas, who gave her day-old scones and asked nothing in return. A librarian named Meredith, who helped her get a library card and started slipping books she thought Elizabeth might like into her bag quietly without a word. In time, Elizabeth found herself on the town bulletin board. Crafts for Elders. Reclaiming hands, reclaiming joy. It was a small offering. A class on paper folding, bookbinding, sewing. She posted the flyer with trembling fingers and no expectation. But on the first day, 6 people came. On the second week, there were 12. By the end of the first month, the community center gave her a room. They came with crooked hands and aching backs, with stories about losing children or surviving wars or outliving every single friend they'd ever had. But they sat beside her in a circle, their hands working through cloth and thread, and something began to heal, not just in them, in her. One morning a letter arrived. It was postmarked Seattle. The handwriting was young but careful, the loops wide and hopeful. Elizabeth read the return name and pressed the envelope to her heart before opening it. Inside, "Dear Grandma, I hope you like your new house. I saw pictures of Vermont online. The trees look like magic. We read Little Women in class, and it made me think of you. Jo reminds me of you, not just because she's strong, but because she doesn't wait for people to tell her who she is. She decides. I think that's very brave. Mom is getting better. She cries sometimes, but she makes pancakes now. She even hugged me once last week. That hasn't happened in a long time. They say I'll probably be allowed to choose where I live next year. I think about that a lot. But mostly I just hope you're happy. I miss you every day, but I'm glad you're there. I like thinking of you in the snow with all those people and your crafts. Maybe one day I can visit. Love always, Emily." Elizabeth closed the letter slowly. Her hands shook, but she smiled. It was the kind of smile that didn't need an audience, the kind that lived deep in the marrow. Winter came hard to Vermont. The wind carved through the hills like glass. But her little house was warm. The wood stove crackled every night. She made soup from scratch and bread from memory. On Sundays, she hosted a tiny supper for some of the ladies from the class potluck style. They brought mismatched dishes and mismatched stories and stayed late laughing into their wine. Her hands began to heal. The joints loosened. The ache faded. One of her students, a former florist named Louise, brought her a note one day. "You gave us back something we didn't know we lost." It hung on her fridge beside Emily's first drawing from months ago. Meanwhile, the world outside her small town turned. Brent's trial was swift and brutal. The headline screamed again. Celebrity surgeon sentenced to 12 years for unlawful surgeries. Fatal negligence. Elizabeth watched the footage online but turned off the sound. His expression was blank as the sentence was read. Natalie sat behind him. No makeup, her shoulders rigid. She looked like she was trying to disappear into the pew. Elizabeth didn't feel vindicated. She didn't need to. The truth had its own legs now. It didn't need her name to run. Natalie lost temporary custody of Emily shortly after Brent's arrest. The court cited emotional neglect and enabling behavior. Emily stayed with an aunt for several months, then a court counselor. There was talk of therapy, supervised visits. And every week another letter came. Emily never asked her to come back. She simply kept writing. That was enough. In early March, Elizabeth stood on her porch and watched the first buds push through the snow. She wore a thick sweater and fingerless gloves. In her hands, she held another letter from Emily. This one included a drawing, a picture of two houses, one small and surrounded by trees, the other tall and full of shadows. In between them, a little girl with a suitcase. Beneath it, the words, "I'm not there yet, but I'm walking." Elizabeth cried then, but they weren't the same kind of tears. They didn't fall from brokenness. They fell from knowing she had lit something behind her, and that flame was still burning in the dark. In town, people began to know her name, not as a survivor, not as a whistleblower, not even as a grandmother, just as Elizabeth, Miss Carter, the one who taught crafts and made hot cider, the one who always had room for one more chair. They didn't ask where she'd come from. They only cared that she'd stayed, and slowly, steadily, her story stopped being about escape. It became about becoming something new, something full, something free. One afternoon, Meredith from the library stopped by. She brought a book Elizabeth had requested wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a note. "You remind me of Joe, too." Elizabeth laughed, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't running or hiding or waiting for someone to hand her permission. She was exactly where she needed to be, no longer a mother defined by others, no longer a shadow in someone else's house, but her own light, her own beginning, and this time she wasn't going anywhere. It was the quiet hour late afternoon when the sun touched the tops of the pine trees with gold, and everything seemed suspended between breath and stillness when the knock came. 3 soft raps, then silence. Elizabeth had been in the middle of tying the last stitch on a cloth doll meant for one of the elder ladies in her Wednesday class. Her hands froze midair. The needle dangled from the red thread like a heartbeat paused. No one came unannounced in Maple Hollow. She opened the door slowly, and there stood Natalie. Her daughter looked thinner, smaller somehow, like grief, and shame had shaved something off her bones. Her once perfect coat hung wrinkled and too large from her frame. Her hair was pulled back without care, and in her eyes Elizabeth saw a kind of surrender that was almost childlike. "Natalie." The word came out raw, unguarded. "Hi, Mom," Natalie whispered. "Can I come in?" Elizabeth didn't say yes. She simply stepped aside. Natalie stepped through the doorway like someone walking into a memory, slow, almost reluctant. Her eyes flicked around the little cottage, taking in the warmth, the cluttered charm, the woven baskets stacked in corners, the half-read books on the windowsill, the handmade quilt draped over the back of the rocking chair. "It's beautiful," she murmured. Elizabeth gave a quiet nod, still watching her carefully. Natalie sat down at the kitchen table and wrapped her hands around the mug Elizabeth set in front of her. "Chamomile. No sugar." "I didn't know where else to go," Natalie said after a while. "I didn't think you'd even open the door." Elizabeth sat across from her, her face unreadable. "I almost didn't. I deserve that." They sat in silence. The tea cooled. The shadows lengthened across the floor. Natalie cleared her throat. "The custody hearing is next month. The judge wants a transitional placement until then. Someone Emily knows. Someone safe." Elizabeth's chest tightened. You want her to stay with me. Just weekends for now, Natalie said quickly. A few days to let her breathe, to sleep. She hasn't been resting well. She cries in her room, refuses to see the counselor. Elizabeth looked away. And now you come, she said, her voice quiet but firm. After all this time, asking me to clean it up again. I'm not asking you to fix anything, Natalie said, tears rising. I'm asking you to help her in a way I can't. Not right now. I don't even know how to look at her without seeing everything I let happen. Elizabeth closed her eyes. When she opened them, her gaze had softened just a little. She can stay for the weekend. Natalie nodded, lips trembling. Thank you. I'm not doing it for you, Elizabeth said. I know. Emily arrived the next afternoon clutching a small suitcase with stickers peeling off the sides and a cardigan too big for her shoulders. The moment she stepped off the bus and saw Elizabeth waiting at the bench, she dropped everything and ran into her grandmother's arms. Elizabeth held her tightly, burying her face in the girl's hair. She smelled like cinnamon and crayons, like childhood still trying to hold itself together. I missed you so much, Emily whispered. I missed you more. They rode home in the old pickup Elizabeth had bought from a neighbor down the road. Emily rolled the window halfway down and let the wind tangle her hair. This place smells like trees, she said. It smells like starting over, Elizabeth replied. Oh. The weekend unfolded slowly. That first night, Elizabeth made roasted vegetables and warm cornbread. Emily devoured everything without a word. Afterward, they sat on the floor threading beads onto string, an old tradition from when Emily was 6, and convinced she could open a jewelry stand on the sidewalk. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. That night, Elizabeth tucked Emily into the small guest bed and brushed the girl's hair with a wooden comb. Do you think I'm broken? Emily asked suddenly. Elizabeth's hand stilled. No, sweetheart, she said. I think you're healing. Emily rolled over and hugged her pillow. Sometimes I wish I could forget everything. Elizabeth leaned down and kissed her forehead. I don't want you to forget, she whispered. I want you to remember that you survived it. Emily fell asleep within minutes. No nightmares, just breathing. The next morning, Elizabeth made pancakes and told Emily about Vermont's covered bridges and how maple syrup is harvested. Then they went to the community center where Emily shyly helped gather paintbrushes for the older women's art group. One woman handed her a knitted scarf. For a helper, she said. Emily beamed. Back home, Elizabeth took out an embroidery hoop and a piece of white linen. Want to learn? She asked. Emily nodded. They spent the afternoon stitching daisies and Crooked Heart's fingers fumbling, laughter echoing. In the evening, Elizabeth pulled out an old photo album. Emily curled beside her on the couch, warm under the quilt. Who's that? She asked, pointing at a black and white photo of a young woman with wild hair and paint on her jeans. That's me, Elizabeth said. No way. Yes way. You look like you could fight someone. I did, Elizabeth smiled many times. Emily giggled, then grew quiet. Grandma. Yes, I like you better now. Elizabeth turned. What do you mean? You're lighter, happier. You used to feel tired even when you smiled. Elizabeth felt her throat tighten. She nodded. I am better now. Emily rested her head on her shoulder. Me too. Sunday came too quickly. They sat on the porch with hot cocoa, watching the sky turn soft with clouds. Emily clutched her embroidery like treasure. I don't want to leave, she said quietly. I don't want you to, Elizabeth replied. But I want you to be okay, even if you're far. Emily looked up at her. I think I'm only okay when I'm with you. Elizabeth held her close. You'll be okay because of who you are, not where you are. Emily nodded slowly. Do you think Mom will get better? I think she already is, Elizabeth said. But she'll need time. Emily stood walking to the edge of the porch. I want to come back next weekend. Elizabeth smiled. We'll make more pancakes. And stitch stars this time. Yes, Elizabeth said. Stars. That evening, when the bus pulled away with Emily waving from the back window, Elizabeth stood on the gravel path, her heart both full and aching. Natalie had stayed in the car, not daring to step out. But as the bus disappeared around the curve, she rolled down the window. She slept through the night, she asked. Yes, Natalie's voice cracked. Thank you. Elizabeth didn't answer right away. Then quietly, she's not a second chance. She's her own beginning. Natalie nodded. I know. She rolled the window up, drove away. Elizabeth stood for a long time, the wind rustling her coat, her hands still holding the echo of Emily's embrace. Forgiveness wasn't loud. It didn't announce itself with grand declarations. It arrived in soft weekends, in needle and thread, in a child's first good sleep. And in that moment Elizabeth understood. She hadn't just survived. She had begun. The courtroom smelled like polished wood and old air. Elizabeth sat straight in the front row, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her pulse a slow, steady drumbeat beneath her skin. Beside her sat a court-appointed advocate, and just a few feet behind Natalie, quiet, fragile-looking, her hands trembling in her lap, but composed. Emily dressed in her best dress and the cardigan Elizabeth had knit. Her last winter clutched a worn sketchbook and stared at the judge without fear. It had taken months, evaluations, home visits, therapist letters, school reports, but this was the final moment. The judge, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a tone like iron, cleared her throat. Based on the recommendations provided and the child's expressed wishes, I am ruling in favor of granting Elizabeth Carter temporary guardianship of Emily Carter, with the option for full custody upon reevaluation in 6 months. The gavel dropped. The words felt like warm thunder in Elizabeth's chest. She let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. Behind her, Natalie gave a quiet sob. Elizabeth turned. Their eyes met. Natalie didn't speak, but she nodded, and that was enough. Outside the courthouse, the sky had cleared after a morning of gray drizzle. Light broke through the clouds like a soft chorus. Elizabeth held Emily's hand as they stepped into the sun. "Are you sure you're okay?" she asked. Emily nodded. "I didn't feel scared," she whispered. "Not even once." Elizabeth smiled. "That's because you're braver than you know." They stood for a while on the courthouse steps, watching cars pass and pigeons flutter in the square. Eventually Natalie approached. She looked tired and relieved. Elizabeth turned to face her Emily, still holding her hand. Natalie knelt. "Baby," she said to her daughter, "you know this isn't goodbye, right?" Emily nodded slowly. "I know, Mom." Natalie reached out, brushing a piece of hair from the girl's forehead. "I love you," she said. "I love you too," Emily whispered. Natalie looked up at Elizabeth. "Thank you," she said. Elizabeth gave a soft nod. "No more shadows," she said. "That's the only condition." Natalie managed a smile, weak but real. No more shadows. Back in Vermont, the town welcomed Emily like she'd always belonged. The local school enrolled her mid-term. The principal, a soft-spoken woman named Mrs. Alden, gave her a tour while the other children stared curiously through the windows. By the end of her first week, Emily had made friends with 2 other girls in the art club. She joined the library's weekend story circle. She helped Elizabeth make supper every Tuesday and always asked to light the wood stove. And she slept soundly every night. A month later, Elizabeth stood on the stage of the town hall during the annual spring fundraiser. The room smelled of fresh flowers and old varnish, and the wooden chairs creaked beneath aging townsfolk and curious newcomers alike. Elizabeth adjusted the microphone. She hadn't spoken publicly since the trial. Her hands didn't shake. "Good evening," she said, her voice clear. "When I came to Maple Hollow, I came with nothing but a suitcase, a tired heart, and a name I was trying to remember belonged to me." She paused. Laughter rippled softly. "But this town gave me more than a place to land. It gave me purpose, and tonight I want to give something back." She looked toward the second row where Emily sat holding a bouquet of wildflowers. "I am establishing the Carter Beacon Scholarship, named for my late husband, William Carter, a man who believed that light should be passed, not hoarded. The fund will provide tuition supplies and mentorship for children without stable homes, because no child should feel invisible, and no child should wait in silence for someone to choose them." Applause, some tearful, some standing, but Elizabeth's eyes stayed on her granddaughter, and in Emily's eyes was something that needed no words. Spring gave way to summer. Elizabeth's home bloomed with color sunflowers, sage lavender tomatoes climbing trellises in the backyard. Emily painted the birdbath blue and added little mosaic tiles around the base. Every morning she fed the sparrows and read poetry aloud from the porch swing. On weekends they took long walks into the forest trails, collecting leaves and pressing them into handmade journals. Elizabeth taught her how to stitch borders along the pages, how to tell stories without writing a word. They wrote a picture book together, Grandma and the Lighthouse. It wasn't about a building. It was about a woman who found the switch inside her and decided never to turn it off again. At the annual school arts night, Emily stood proudly in front of her embroidered canvas, a field of stars and a stitched quote. "We are not made to live in shadows." Beneath it, EC. No one asked what it meant, but everyone felt it. Mrs. Alden gave Elizabeth a wink as she passed. "She's going to be okay," she whispered. Elizabeth smiled. "I think we both are." Sometimes late at night, Elizabeth would sit by the window and think about the life she'd left behind. The house in Portland, the dinners with Brent and Natalie, the chilling silence in the hallways. She didn't regret walking away. She didn't wish she'd done it sooner. She simply sat with it, let it live in the corner of her mind, not to haunt her, but to remind her how far she'd come. Forgiveness, she realized, wasn't something you gave just once. It was a practice, a rhythm, a sunrise you had to choose to see every morning. And she did. Letters still came from Natalie, now handwritten, sometimes long, sometimes awkward, sometimes just a drawing or a pressed leaf. Elizabeth responded when she had something to say, and sometimes she simply held the letter to her chest. That was enough. Emily didn't ask questions. She just kept drawing stars. By August, the town started referring to Elizabeth differently, not as the new woman from out west, not as the one with the past, but as Elizabeth Carter, the woman who gave old hands new purpose, the woman who taught girls to thread needles and told boys that crying was brave, the woman who ran a scholarship, fixed broken zippers, and still made the best blackberry pie in 3 counties. She had become a mother again, a grandmother, a guide, a flame for others still lost in their own dusk. One Sunday, as they packed for a weekend trip to a lake nearby, Emily looked up from her duffel bag. "Grandma, yes. Do you ever miss being invisible?" Elizabeth looked at her, and then slowly smiled. "No," she said, "not anymore." Emily grinned. "Good." She zipped her bag. "Because I think you were born to glow." Elizabeth laughed. "I think you were too." They stepped out into the sunlight, their shadows falling behind them. And for the first time in a long, long time, Elizabeth never looked back. The late October morning unfolded with a kind of golden hush. In Maple Hollow fall came like an old friend, slow and luminous, brushing the trees with amber and fire, scattering red leaves like confetti across porches and gravel roads. Outside Elizabeth's window, the sugar maples stood ablaze, their branches dancing gently in the wind. Inside the little cottage was warm with light. Elizabeth sat at her writing desk, a simple worn piece of oak near the back window. The kettle hissed in the kitchen. Her reading glasses rested on the edge of an opened novel. A candle burned beside her, the flame small and steady. She was sewing when the knock came, a soft, familiar rhythm. Not urgent, not afraid, just present. She opened the door to find no one standing there, only a small brown package resting on the doormat. She brought it inside, unwrapped the twine slowly, carefully. Inside was a bracelet, a simple loop of hand-woven thread, blue and gold and green, the colors of Vermont sky, her garden, and something deeper. Alongside it, a folded letter written in pencil on thick paper. Elizabeth opened it, and as she read, her eyes glistened. "Dear Grandma, I made this in art class. It's not perfect, but it's strong, like you. Sometimes when the lights go out in my room at Mom's house, I close my eyes and picture your garden, the one with the wind chimes and the bench that smells like cinnamon. I picture you in the kitchen humming and stirring soup. I think about the way your hands move when you sew and how you never rush, even when things get hard. You once told me that people don't always choose who they're born from, but they get to choose who they become. And I chose you. You're not just my grandma. You're my light. Love, Emily." Elizabeth pressed the paper to her chest and sat down, not because she was tired, but because her heart had become too full to hold while standing. The hours passed gently. She wore the bracelet like a badge, the thread snug on her wrist warmed by her pulse. Later, as dusk began to bloom on the horizon, she wandered into the garden. The last asters of the season still bloomed near the fence line. The apple tree had surrendered most of its fruit, and the wind carried the smell of drying leaves and distant chimney smoke. She sat on the bench beneath the arbor. A carved wooden box rested beside her. Inside it, a stack of old photos, a notebook of poetry, and a small brass pocket watch. It had once belonged to Brent, a gift from Natalie during his rise to fame. He'd worn it like a crown, a symbol of control, of order, of cold precision. Elizabeth had kept it not out of sentiment, but as a reminder. Today she opened the watch and listened. The tick-tick was slow, steady, arrogant, like it still believed it ran the world. She held it in her hand for a long while. Then without a word she closed it gently and set it on the bench. She would no longer carry its weight. She had learned something greater. Time does not rule the brave. The porch light flickered on behind her as the sky faded into ink. Stars began to pulse one by one above the hills. Inside, the fire crackled. Her rocking chair awaited, along with Emily's newest letter, the one she read twice a week, just to hear the girl's voice in her mind. There was a jar of cider cooling and a basket of dried lavender on the floor beside her knitting bag. And there was silence. Not the cold kind, the kind that holds you, the kind that feels earned. In town, her scholarship had already helped 3 students enroll in school. One had begun writing plays. Another was apprenticing with the local carpenter. The third, a quiet girl named Sam, had started a zine about surviving loss. Elizabeth kept their letters in a folder marked Proof of Light. Every month it grew thicker. Some nights the old fear still tried to whisper, the echo of Natalie's slap, the chilled horror of that body in Brent's basement, the sting of being told to forget, to shrink, to stay silent. But those ghosts had lost their grip. She had faced them, and in doing so she had named them. She had replaced silence with stories, darkness with art, fear with footsteps forward. A few weeks after the package arrived, she received another. It was from Natalie, inside a photograph. Emily at her new school play, in costume, playing the sun, her arms outstretched, painted rays on her cheeks, her smile wide and brave. Elizabeth stared at it for a long time. Then she placed it on the mantel beside her wedding photo, not to replace, but to reflect. Light begets light. When the first snow came, Elizabeth was ready. She stacked firewood by the door, hung a wreath of dried pine cones and sage, set extra quilts on the bed, and bought a tiny tree to decorate with Emily when she arrived for winter break. Outside, the garden slept beneath a soft blanket of frost, but inside her heart was evergreen. Not young, not untouched, but alive, seasoned, sturdy, steeped in story. One evening, as she sat by the fire, Elizabeth picked up her embroidery hoop. The linen had already been stitched with stars and branches and the silhouette of a house. In the bottom corner, she began a new thread gold, a single word, light. She didn't rush the stitching. She wanted it to last. Each loop was a memory, each pull of the needle a vow. Time no longer moved against her. It walked beside her. She had stopped measuring it in regrets or birthdays or broken expectations. Now it was counted in letters from Emily, in the way the sun touched her hands as she taught a new class, in the rhythm of her own breath, peaceful, present, and unafraid. The story of Elizabeth Carter didn't end with rescue. It wasn't defined by what she left behind. It was built by what she chose to become, a woman who stitched truth into silence, who grew a life from ashes, who taught others how to hold a needle and believe again. She was no longer the mother in the shadow. She had stepped out fully and completely into the light, and from that place she shined, always.